Hi folks, in this video we get some practice doing harder proofs with existential EElim. Let me first address one of the most common questions I get, one of the hardest things I think that there is about doing formal proofs with quantifiers. We have two difficult rules, existential EElim and universal intro, which require these subproofs that start with an arbitrary name, so this @n notation. And the trouble is, sometimes you put something next to the @n and sometimes you don't. And this can be confusing. People always ask me, how do I know whether I put something there? Do I just have to guess? I never know. Well, let me tell you, you never have to guess. There is a way that you can always figure out exactly what to put next to this or whether to put something next to it at all. So the question you ask yourself, this is the key. You ask yourself, why did I start this subproof with @n in the first place? And the answer to that question tells you whether you put something next to it. Because there are only two rules that tell you to talk about an arbitrary name n. One of them is existential EElim, the other is universal intro. So here's the answer. If you're doing an existential EElim, then yes, you need to put something next to the @n. If you're doing universal intro, then no, you leave it blank. You just leave the @n alone and you write assume in the justification area. So there is never a mystery. Whenever you start a subproof with @n, you should always know why you are starting the subproof. It's because either you know an existential sentence or because you're trying to get to a universal sentence. And if you know why you started the subproof, you will know whether to put something there or not. In the one case, in the existential case, you do, and in the universal case, you do not. Okay, let's do a harder proof with quantifiers. So pause your videos and see if you can figure out how to do this. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. Let's talk about the answer. What do I do first? Well, I have two quantifiers. I have an existential premise and a universal premise, and I have an existential conclusion. Now, the existential conclusion does not tell me what to do first. Instead, the existential premise is the key. When I have a universal premise, of course, I love universal premises. I know that I'm going to instantiate that for some name or other, but I don't start with that because look, there's no name in this proof that's the obvious candidate for instantiating that thing. But existential EElim, kind of like when you have a disjunction and it tells you to do disjunction EElim, when you have an existential premise, it tells you to do existential EElim. So I am going to start a subproof and declare an arbitrary name n just because I know this existential premise. Existential premises are great. They tell you what to do. They tell you to start subproofs and write the assumption line of this structure. Now, why did I write something next to the arbitrary name n here? Because I asked myself, why did I start the subproof? Because I'm doing an existential, and I always have to do a sentence next to it. The structure of the thing inside the scope of that existential is exactly the structure of this thing here. And I replace all of the variables with my arbitrary name n. Now I stop and reevaluate. I have to ask myself, how do I keep making progress? Well, that's a wide scope conjunction. So I'm just going to bring down my conjuncts. I'm going to bring down the P of n and then the not Q. How do I keep making progress? Well, now finally, I have to make sure I'm using my other premise, the universal quantifier, which I knew I was going to instantiate. Once I'm talking about object n from the domain, I know what I want to instantiate it for, namely that n thing. So that's why I put n's in the place of x's when I do universal EElim there. Now, again, I'm just going to look at my structure. I have two literals, so those do not tell me what to do. I have to wait. I have an arrow claim. That also, I'm not going to first assume this antecedent right away. That would be a bad idea. Don't assume the antecedent of an arrow that you have. Instead, I have to think, how could I earn the right to this antecedent so I could do arrow EElim? Well, I just look at the structure of that thing. Since that's a disjunction, I just ask myself if I can prove it. And of course, the answer is yes, I can prove it because I know P of n. So that's just disjunction intro. And once I've got that, I can do my arrow EElim. Now, how do I make progress now? Again, I'm back to a literal. So there's no rules that I can apply to this. You have to look at where you're going at some point, and I have to see the structure of this existential. I know I'm going to do existential intro because this is a wide scope existential, but I have to build the structure of that thing first from the inside before I tack the existential quantifier out front on it. So I have to first get not Q and R. Of course, I have to prove them of some object, but luckily I'm talking about n, and I know not Q of n, and I know R of n. So that's why I can build that conjunction first. Then I do the existential quantifier around it. Now, why did I do that now inside the scope of the subproof? Because I'm not allowed to export something with the name N in it. Then the name N would appear outside the subproof and it wouldn't be totally arbitrary and it would violate the rules for arbitrary names. But if I do my existential intro first on line 10, then this thing can be exported with existential EElim because it lacks that quantifier, or excuse me, because it lacks that arbitrary name N. It just has the existential quantifier. So remember how you cite existential EElim. You have to cite the existential you're eliminating, which is on line 1. The reason I started that subproof in the first place is what you always have to go back to. Then I just cite this whole subproof, which is 3-10, and I am done. Okay, thanks.